September 16, 1945, Koga, Ibaraki Prefecture. Late summer in Japan, and the heat lies close to the ground as if it has nowhere else to go. The war has ended, yet the air still feels occupied by it. Dust from broken roads, smoke stains on distant timbers, the faint metallic odor of rails that have carried too many evacuees and too little food. A U.S. Jeep rolls forward at a cautious pace. Its engine note is unfamiliar in these streets, lower, steadier, confident in a country that has learned to listen for the whine of bombers instead. Children appear first, not as a crowd but as separate figures. Thin limbs, oversized shirts, bare knees, faces sharpened by hunger. They do not run at first. They approach as if approaching a rumor. An American soldier, young enough to still look startled by his own survival, leans down from the vehicle. He reaches into his pocket and produces a small piece of candy. The gesture is almost casual, as if he has performed it 100 times in 100 towns. But here, in this defeated landscape, the motion carries the weight of disbelief. The children close in. Hands rise. Eyes widen. For a moment, the future is reduced to something that can fit in a palm. In surviving footage from that day, the children crowd the soldier and then follow him, as if the simplest sweetness has turned the occupier into a compass, pointing somewhere beyond the ruins. Source https://www.criticalpest.com Video 65675044961. American soldier children follow civilians crowded around a soldier Japanese children. This moment matters because it captures the occupation at its most intimate scale. Before policy became routine, before new textbooks and new laws could explain what had happened. The surrender of Japan was a political event, signed on steel and paper, broadcast in formal words and imperial cadence. But surrender also had to be understood by ordinary people, and especially by children who had not signed anything, who did not command armies, who only knew that the adult world had demanded sacrifice and then collapsed anyway. They would be among the first to measure the new era not in constitutional articles but in sensations. The taste of unfamiliar sugar, the feel of paper wrappers, the sight of a foreign hand offering rather than taking. For years, the Japanese state had built a moral universe in which hardship was holiness. Scarcity was not merely a consequence of war. It was presented as proof of national character. The home front was instructed to endure rationing with quiet pride, to accept smaller meals and fewer possessions as patriotic discipline. Children were taught this lesson early. Their schooling and youth organizations emphasized obedience, sacrifice, and the collective. Even their play was shaped by wartime reality. And yet by 1945, the scarcity had become catastrophic. Cities were burned, supply chains shattered, families displaced. Hunger stopped being a temporary inconvenience and became the rhythm of daily life. For children, this meant not simply empty stomachs but shortened childhoods, fewer chances to play, fewer possessions that belonged only to them. A toy, in such a world, became more than entertainment. It became evidence that a child might live long enough to be playful again. Then came the Americans, men in uniforms that had been described, in wartime propaganda, as the clothing of beasts. Japanese propaganda in the Pacific War did not merely criticize the enemy, it dehumanized him. Teaching materials summarizing the racial propaganda of the period note that Japanese messaging often depicted Americans and Europeans as beasts, vermin, or demons, threatening Japanese civilization. Source https://www.classroom.org/system/files/essays/whip019 PDF. In that psychological landscape, the approaching Jeep in Koga is not only a vehicle, it is the physical arrival of the monster children have been warned about. This is where the story's emotional contrast sharpens because the contrast is not subtle. It is immediate, sensory, undeniable. What Japanese children expected, shaped by years of fear and instruction, was violence. They expected that conquerors would mock them, strike them, steal what little they had left. They expected humiliation, or worse, a cold indifference to their suffering. They expected the kind of power that expresses itself by stepping on the weak. What many American soldiers expected, shaped by the Pacific War's brutality, was hostility, silent hatred, sudden attack, stubborn refusal. The war against Japan had been fought with a ferocity that left deep scars on both sides. Many U.S. servicemen arrived carrying grief, anger, and the memory of comrades lost on islands where surrender had been rare and resistance relentless. They might have expected civilians to look at them with contempt or terror. They might have expected to be hated, and in some cases they were. Then the reality of occupation began not as a grand political drama, but as a thousand small. The MITH archive entry on occupied Japan notes a pattern that appeared wherever American bases existed. GIs tossed candy and gum to local children. Source: https archive myth umd edu/gcr/public/display theme php% 3 fid = 34. HTML. The words are plain, almost understated, but their implications are enormous. Candy and gum are not necessities. They are small luxuries. To distribute them openly in a starving country is not merely generosity. It is a display of a particular kind of capacity, an industrial, logistical, and cultural confidence that says, "We have enough to spare." And this is where one symbolic object can hold the story together like a thread through smoke: the chocolate bar. In the American military system, chocolate, often issued as part of rations, was portable energy and morale. It was packaged, standardized, and replaceable. For many soldiers, it was ordinary. For hungry Japanese children, it could be astonishing. A single object that carried sweetness, calories, and the smell of a world that had not been burned down. Images and footage from the occupation era often show Japanese children pressing close to Americans for chocolate, an early visual shorthand for the shock of contact between scarcity and abundance. One stock photo record explicitly describes Japanese children crowding American officer for chocolate in occupied Japan, 1945, after the surrender. Source: https://www. Bridgman Images. com/nus/nordistknown/occupy Japan 1945 after the surrender. Japanese children crowding American officer for chocolate/foe/asset/3,036,449. The chocolate bar in this narration is not merely food. It is a recurring symbol of American abundance, and by extension, the persuasive force of democratic industrial modernity. Not democracy as an abstract ideal, but democracy as something that, at least in American self-image, could produce enough that generosity was possible without immediate collapse. In Koga, the candy being handed out is not necessarily chocolate, but the act is the same, a transfer of something extra. And the sound that accompanies it, the soft crinkle of packaging, becomes a quiet motif. In a devastated nation where nothing is wasted, where wrappers might be saved or repurposed, the casual tearing of paper and foil is almost as shocking as the sweetness itself. It signals a world in which some things can be opened and consumed without. In the critical past footage, the children follow the soldier through the street. They are not organized. They are not chanting. They are simply drawn by the gravitational pull of possibility. Source: https://www. Criticalpast. Com video 65675044961. American soldier children follow civilians crowded around a soldier Japanese children. It is an image that does not fit neatly into wartime expectations on either side. The occupier is not being attacked. The conquered are not shrinking away in terror. Instead, a strange new relationship begins to form, one built, at first, on ration items and small gifts. And toys, when they appear, make that relationship even more symbolically charged. A toy is the opposite of a weapon. It is designed for hands that are not meant to kill. It is built for imagination, not for obedience. In the wreckage of a militarized society, a toy can feel like an act of ideological sabotage, not because it carries a slogan, but because it suggests the child is allowed to be a child again. It suggests that the future belongs not to sacrifice but to growth. To understand why Japanese children couldn't believe Americans shared toys, one must understand what sharing meant in 1945 Japan. Sharing had been demanded by the state, shared suffering, shared rationing, shared obedience. But this was different. This was voluntary. It was not extracted, it was offered. And an offered gift carries a different moral meaning than an allocated ration. A ration is controlled. A gift is chosen. The occupation was not gentle across the board. It was a military regime that controlled institutions and imposed reforms. Yet at street level, the smallest acts often carried disproportionate emotional force, especially for children. When an American soldier gave a sweet, a toy, or a piece of gum, it was not only the object that mattered. It was the contradiction. If the enemy was a demon, why did he feed a child? If the conqueror was a beast, why did he give away something valuable? If the victor's heart was supposed to be cruel, why did his hand open? These contradictions did not instantly erase trauma or propaganda, but they began to loosen the rigid wartime narrative. The chocolate bar returns here as a kind of quiet argument. It makes no speech. It simply exists. It says, there is enough, there is extra, there is sweetness not reserved only for the powerful. It is not a perfect representation of democracy, and the occupation itself was not a pure democratic exchange. But symbols do not need to be perfect. They need to be memorable. And for many children, the first memorable thing about Americans was not a lecture or a punishment, but an unexpected gift. Even the archive note that GIs tossed candy and gum carries an edge. Tossed suggests casualness and almost careless abundance. Source: https archive myth edu/gcr/public/display theme php%3fid equals 34. HTML: in a place where every grain of rice mattered, casualness could feel like magic or like insult, depending on how it was delivered and received. Yet for children, casual abundance often reads as wonder. Now consider the psychological terrain of Japan immediately after surrender. Adults carried shame, grief, and exhaustion. Many had lost family in bombings, battles, or starvation. Many had believed in victory until the last moment, or had been forced to pretend they did. The Emperor's surrender broadcast did not erase the years of indoctrination. It shattered them, leaving fragments that cut inward. In such a moment, children were often the most flexible, less invested in ideological pride, more responsive to direct experience. The occupation would try to remake Japan through institutions, but children were being remade through encounters. And the encounters were often simple: a soldier in a jeep, a pocket opened, a wrapper torn, a piece of sweetness placed into a hand that had known mostly emptiness. In Koga, the children do not appear to fear the soldier once the candy appears. They appear to trust the logic of hunger. Hunger is not ideology. Hunger is immediate. When hunger is met with food rather than violence, the mind begins to rewrite its story. That rewrite is the transformation at the heart of this narrative, the shift from mythic enemy to human presence. For Japanese children, Americans could begin as monsters in the imagination and become, through repeated small acts, something else, still foreign, still powerful, but no longer purely terrifying. For American soldiers, Japanese civilians, especially children, could begin as faceless enemy population and become individuals. The war had demanded dehumanization to function. Peace demanded rehumanization to last. The chocolate bar as symbol also points to a larger truth about the post-war world. Industrial capacity became moral theater. The United States emerged from the war not devastated at home, but strengthened economically, capable of projecting supplies across oceans. Japan emerged shattered. When American soldiers shared sweets, they were not only expressing kindness, they were expressing the fact that the American system could produce a surplus. Surplus is not just material, it is psychological. A society with surplus can afford gestures. It can afford to turn enemies into future partners. A society without surplus often cannot. Yet the narration must remain honest. Abundance did not automatically mean virtue. The same American production that made candy available also made bombs available. The same supply lines that carried chocolate carried weapons. Abundance is power. It can feed or destroy. In 1945 Japan, children encountered the feeding side first, and that order mattered. The recurring sound of the wrapper becomes, in this sense, an audible turning point. In wartime Japan, sounds had meant danger. The siren, the drone, the crack of fire, the collapse of wood. In the first months of occupation, a new sound entered the soundscape of the street, paper and foil opening. A small, domestic sound, yet it carried the implication that the worst sounds might be fading. When toys appear in this landscape, their meaning intensifies again. A toy is not calories, it is not survival, it is something beyond survival. It tells a child, you are allowed to imagine, you are allowed to play. You are allowed to have something that does not serve the state. That is why a Japanese child might have trouble believing it. Not because kindness is impossible, but because wartime life had trained the child to interpret power as extraction. The empire had extracted metal, time, obedience, even childhood itself. Now a foreign power appears and in small moments gives. It is destabilizing. It does not fit the moral logic the child has been taught. The MITH archive entry also notes that occasionally GIs adopted a Japanese child. Source https archive myth edu/gcr/public/display theme php% 3fid equals 34. HTML, that fact, stated plainly, suggests the depth of some relationships that formed amid occupation. Not only passing gifts, but sustained responsibility, complicated by inequality, culture, and the realities of military life. Even when adoption was rare, the very idea would have felt unimaginable during the war years when the enemy was depicted as subhuman. The transformation is therefore not merely individual. It is cultural and ideological. It begins to shift the axis of identity from wartime absolutism toward a post-war pragmatism. It opens space for the notion that yesterday's enemy might be tomorrow's teacher, protector, customer, or ally. And the child, small, hungry, watching a soldier share, becomes the site where that transformation is most visible, because children are where societies place their future. In the documentary rhythm, we return again to that street-level image, children swarming a jeep. It is not a staged diplomatic gesture. It is not a summit. It is a moment captured because it was visually striking, because it did not look like the final scenes of a brutal Pacific War were supposed to look. Zors, the camera sees the children's faces. It sees the soldier's posture, careful, slightly awkward, as if he is not sure what his presence means in this street. The incomprehension. The children cannot fully read the soldier cannot fully read the children, but the object in his hand is readable in any language. Sweetness needs no translation. This is how ideology is sometimes undone, not through argument, but through experience that refuses to match the story you were given. For Japanese children, the wartime story was simple. Americans are monsters. Surrender means annihilation. The enemy will destroy what remains. Yet the first American many children encountered did not destroy anything in that instant. He gave away part of his ration. That does not absolve the broader horrors of war or occupation, but it introduces a crack in the wall of certainty. And once a wall cracks, it becomes vulnerable to weather, time, and human contact. The chocolate bar motif returns as the crack widens. In the mind of a child, the taste becomes a memory that competes with propaganda. The memory does not erase everything else. Fear can persist, resentment can be inherited, trauma can echo. But memory can also seed complexity. A child who has tasted unexpected kindness may grow into an adult less willing to accept a single, absolute narrative about enemies. This is one of the quiet ways democracies and empires compete, not only through armies, but through what ordinary people come to believe about the other side's humanity. The occupation sought to reshape Japan's political structure, but it also reshaped Japan's emotional map. And for many children, the first landmark on that new map was not a government building, but a gift. A toy held in both hands, a chocolate bar broken in half.